43. The time for members' statements has concluded. The Prime Minister on indulgence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and the Leader of the Opposition and I discussed this earlier today. The very sad news, Mr Speaker, all on this side of the House, and I'm sure across the whole House, and indeed the other chamber, which is adjourning, Mr Speaker, are deeply saddened by the news of the passing of Senator Alex Gallagher. Senator Gallagher served in this parliament for 10 years. Born in Scotland, his father headed out here, in Senator Gallagher's own words, for a better chance for him and his family. That's what this country is all about. That's the country he served. I know members will want to gather their thoughts and to pay a complete tribute to Senator Gallagher in the next few days, and for there to be all condolences and honours due to a serving member of the parliament. And we will indeed do that, Mr Speaker. We will honour this servant of Australia, a man who loved his adopted country, who loved the party he served and was faithful to it, and who found purpose in serving others in our parliament. To all in the Labor movement and the caucus, the Leader of the Opposition, particularly those from South Australia also, we extend our deepest sympathies to all of you. Senator Gallagher's family also, we send our love and our prayers to them also on this terrible day. And may God bless him, may God bless all of you, and may our colleague and friend rest in peace. A motion will be moved, Mr Speaker, tomorrow, which will provide the opportunity for all members to speak to that motion. But here today, we just simply acknowledge him and thank him for his wonderful service, and remember him and what he has done for our country, and we think of his family most of all.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for his warm words and for his message of condolences. It is indeed sad news, the passing of a sitting senator, Senator Alex Gallagher. Alex represented South Australia in the Senate since 2010. He was born in Scotland on the first day of 1954 and came to Australia 12 years later with his parents, like so many migrants, to seek a better life. Alex dedicated his life to the interests of working people, both as a trade unionist and as a senator. He came to this parliament with 17 years of experience of hard physical work as a labourer and truck driver, as well as a ramp services operator at Trans-Australian Airlines. He joined Labor in Darwin in 1988, when he began also to work for his beloved Transport Workers Union, where he became the Secretary of the South Australian Northern Territory branch. In his first speech in the Senate, he named his priorities as the transport sector, superannuation and road safety. In that speech, we saw a glimpse of Alex's humility as he spoke of his love for the transport sector and the people who worked in it. He said this: "There is no smoke and mirrors, just plain talking, hard-working employees and employers alike in a tough, competitive industry that works harder than most people imagine and continues to work while most people are asleep." Alex's career was indeed a fine one. We in Labor are very proud of Alex. He was a conscientious, no-nonsense man who knew what he stood for. Along with his mate Stirling, he was a long-time member of the Senate Rural and Regional Affairs and Transport Committee, and he particularly prioritised road safety for those people in the transport sector who keep our country going and who, during COVID, have continued to keep our country going. Alex was also a family man who was dedicated to his wife, Parla, and also to his children and grandchildren. In that first speech, he quoted US President Theodore Roosevelt, who said, "Far and away the best prize life has to offer is the chance to work hard at work worth doing." Alex did that. He did that as a working man, as a truck driver and in the transport sector, as a transport union official, and then as a senator. On behalf of the Australian Labor Party, for which he was a dedicated member and which he loved and truly served completely every day, we express our condolences to his family, to his friends. May he rest in peace, and we will have an opportunity to more formally honour Senator Gallagher from tomorrow.
As a mark of respect, I am going to ask all present to rise in their places. I thank the House. The Prime Minister with ministerial arrangements.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I inform the House that the Minister for Agriculture in Northern Australia will be absent from question time today, and for the remainder of the week the Deputy Prime Minister will answer questions on his behalf. The Assistant Treasurer will also be absent from question time today, and the remainder of the week the Treasurer will answer questions on his behalf, and the Minister for Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs will be absent from question time today and the remainder of the week, and the Minister for Home Affairs will answer questions on his behalf.
Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Today is another record day of COVID cases, with 1,290 new cases in New South Wales alone. There are 840 people in hospital in New South Wales, 137 of those in intensive care. The Prime Minister congratulated the New South Wales Premier for not locking down Bondi at the start of an outbreak which has now spread to Victoria, here in Canberra and New Zealand. Was this a mistake?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Those matters have already been addressed by me and the Premier of New South Wales, Mr Speaker, and I note also today with the onset of the Delta outbreak that has not only just impacted on New South Wales but on Victoria and indeed the Australian Capital Territory, where we are right now, Mr Speaker. And as cases continue to grow, and if you look at the epidemiological curve for Victoria, it's in the Financial Review today, and you compare it to what's happening in New South Wales, you'll see a very similar profile. And we hope, with the measures that the Victorian government has taken, Mr Speaker, that that curve will indeed bend in the weeks ahead. And we certainly hope that that is the case. But what we do know is the Delta strain has been unlike every other element of this virus that we've seen today, and has completely changed the way in which we seek to manage these issues. Mr Speaker, it is also very sad today that we learn that there have been 1,000 people who've fallen to COVID as a result of this pandemic over the last 18 months. And here we are on the 30th of August of 2021, where 1,000 people in this country have now fallen victim to that virus. And we know overseas, Mr Speaker, that many fell around the world, and indeed they hit that mark in the United Kingdom back in March of last year. Same in the United States, same in France, in April in Canada, Mr Speaker, in September in Israel. This pandemic has reaped a heavy toll, imposed a heavy toll on the entire world, Mr Speaker, and our efforts are focusing on combating it as best as we possibly can. And as a country, more than 30,000 lives, we know, have been saved in this country because of the combined efforts of our government together with the governments at a state and territory level, and most important of all, the great work of Australians around the country doing what they need to do each and every day. And on a day where we have seen those cases rise, where we have seen more than 1,000 cases a day now, becoming more regular, particularly out of New South Wales. We can also say on the weekend 379,114 Australians, Mr Speaker, went and got vaccinated, and that is a great cause for hope.
The member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question goes to the Prime Minister. We are making daily progress on the national plan as more and more Australians, including those in my electorate, continue to arm themselves against COVID-19 through vaccination. Will the Prime Minister please update to the House how this plan will safely restore livelihoods and help to secure Australia's post-pandemic future?
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Fairfax for his question. And while I have this opportunity, can I commend the member for Fairfax for the tremendous work he did as my special envoy on the Brisbane 2032 Olympics, and continues to do that job now, working with the Minister for Sport and the Minister for Infrastructure, Mr Speaker, as we prepare for those wonderful games into the future. And while we're at it, congratulations to all our Paralympians over there in Tokyo who are doing themselves and their families and our whole country proud. Mr Speaker, our national plan is about hope. Our national plan is about opening up, Mr Speaker, not locking down. Our plan is about a safe transition for those states who may have no COVID cases, or those states, Mr Speaker, who are locked down. It is about a safe transition for both of them, so we can move to the situation not too far away that we can live with this virus and not live in fear of it, Mr Speaker. It's about weddings It's about parties and it's about everything, Mr Speaker. It's about all the things that go to life in our country that we enjoy so much. It's about restoring lives. It's about restoring livelihoods. Our plan is about moving forward and it's about securing Australia's future, Mr Speaker, in what will remain a very uncertain world on the other side of this pandemic. Mr Speaker, lockdowns do need to end and future lockdowns do need to be avoided, Mr Speaker. And we know that because we know those lockdowns are taking a terrible toll on our country, on the mental health of our citizens and particularly of our young people, Mr Speaker, on the small businesses who have to struggle through each day, indeed given economic support, but at the same time, Mr Speaker, they would like to see their businesses able to stand up on their own 2 feet. On our children, Mr Speaker, and their education, on our families and on the jobs of Australians. All of these lockdowns and our response is taking a heavy toll. Mr Speaker, we can also not remain locked out of a global economy that is opening up again, with trade and students and travel, tourists and essential workers and others who are needed to drive our economy forward, Mr Speaker. Our national plan is about reconnecting to that global economy that is opening up, which is necessary for every single part of this country to be able to move forward. And Australians agree, because 58% of them have had their first dose of the vaccine. 34% of them over the age of 16, Mr Speaker, have had 2 doses, and more than 50% of those over 50 have had both doses. And now we know that right today, those 16 to 29, Mr Speaker, join that group that are being vaccinated. On the 13th of September, 12 to 15-year-olds will also be able to join those who are getting vaccinated. We're committed to that plan of hope, Mr Speaker. We're committed to seeing Australia open up. We're committed to Australian lives and livelihoods being restored through the implementation of the national plan.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and it goes to the answer that he just gave. Isn't it a fact that no Australian wants to be a part of lockdowns? Every Australian wants to return to life as normal. But the reason why we're in the current predicament is that this Prime Minister thought that it wasn't a race to get vaccines out the door. It wasn't a race to set up national quarantine. If the Prime Minister refuses to acknowledge his mistakes, how can Australians be confident that he won't repeat them?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's all about how you finish the race, Mr Speaker, as I've said to this place before. And what has been achieved in these many months now, Mr Speaker, despite the setbacks that we had early on in the vaccination program, which would have seen our expectation of being able to offer a vaccine to everybody in this country being set back some 4 months from what we originally anticipated. That has already been brought back to being able to do that before the end of the year, and as each vaccination is demonstrating, we believe we'll be able to meet that even sooner, Mr Speaker. And so the demonstration of the government's resolve has been put into place by ensuring that the vaccination rates that we are now achieving, the fact that we're able to bring forward doses, the fact that we've been able to achieve and realise additional supplies, and we have more irons in the fire, Mr Speaker, more irons in the fire that will see further doses, we believe, being made available in this country. All of that demonstrates, Mr Speaker, that the vaccination program that had its challenges earlier have been overcome. Those challenges have been overcome, Mr Speaker, whether it was the hesitancy around the AstraZeneca vaccine, which many shared, Mr Speaker, but this government didn't share, I can assure you. And, Mr Speaker, as we stood up for the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, others sought to cast aspersions on it. But not our government, Mr Speaker. Not our government, Mr Speaker. We continued on. We continued on and saw millions upon millions of Australians continue to receive those AstraZeneca vaccines, which remains a crucial component of the program even now. Even now, Mr Speaker, that AstraZeneca vaccine, of course, is so important, and it's manufactured, Australian-made, right here in our country in Melbourne. And I want to thank all those workers down at CSL, Mr Speaker. I had the opportunity to meet them on many occasions and thank them for the great work that they have done in ensuring that our country could be vaccinated. Mr Speaker, over 10 million vaccines or thereabouts of AstraZeneca vaccines have been achieved. Over 10 million. And that was achieved because our government took the decision last August last August, a year ago, to ensure that we could make them here in Australia. And there are millions upon millions of lives that have been saved as a result of that decision, Mr Speaker.
And I give the call to the member for Nichols.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how sticking to the Morrison-Joyce government's national plan will ensure access to a secure regional workforce, both now and as we continue a safe pathway out of the COVID-19 pandemic? And is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of any alternative policies?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I thank the member for Nichols for his question, and might I just briefly, before also acknowledge the passing of Senator Alex Gallagher, who I worked with. Alex and Sterlo were best of mates. I know Sterlo will be taking this pretty tough as well. To Carla, I wish all the best, and I'll have more to say on Alex at a later stage. I thank the member for Nichols for his question and note what he is currently with his people and dealing with in Shepparton. I note that it is a hot spot, and he has been in close contact with us all the way through, making absolutely certain that his messages get through to me, that his requests get through to the Treasurer, and he is a champion for his people. He's always at the forefront, parochial, hard-working, and I thank him for that. He also knows with SPC and his electorate and the horticultural industry and the farming industry how vitally important it is that we continue on this program of suppression of the virus as we drive towards making sure we hit our targets so that we can give back to the Australian people the liberties and freedoms they were born with and they expect back. We know this is vitally important because there is a connection from the paddock to your dinner plate. If we can't make sure that we get through this as quickly as possible, and we are, then you don't have the farm workers to pick the produce, you don't have the processors to process the produce, you don't have the transport workers from the union that Senator Gallagher was from, the Transport Workers Union, to get them to the supermarkets, and therefore you don't have dinner on your plate. All these things are connected up, and the people in regional Australia are so fundamentally connected up with the people of every suburb of Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. But we are driving forward with this process, and in Greater Shepparton 57% of people have received at least one inoculation. We are driving forward with this process because last week 2 million people were inoculated. We are driving forward with this process because now 57% of Australia have had at least their first shot. We are making sure that we continue on with this task. And it is disappointing that I get a sense that some aren't hoping for the future, but they're hoping for failure on the opposite side, because we are making absolutely certain—
The Deputy Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Scullin will cease interjecting. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, on reflections on members. Given the time we're in, that's about as serious a reflection as you can make. We're talking about the lives of Australians.
The Deputy Prime Minister will be careful with his language, and I don't want to detain the House with the Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Light of the day. But Mr Speaker, I'd have to say I did listen to the Shadow Minister of Health on the weekend on the Insiders, and I did not get any idea of what the Labor Party plan is, not one. And when he was once more put in a corner by the compere Mr Spears and said, "What exactly is your plan? What exactly do you agree with?"
Member for Whitlam.
And there was no answer. There was no definitive answer. And that is the issue. That is the issue. We have a plan, a safe plan, to get you to where so that our nation opens up.
The
Labor,
Deputy
nothing.
Prime Minister's time has concluded. I give the call to the member for Hindmarsh.
Well, thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister and the Minister for Health have both said that having no COVID patients in intensive care is a measure of the government's success. How many COVID patients in how many states are in intensive care today?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The information that I have available to me on those figures currently is in hospital there are 925 people, in ICU there are 155, and those who are on ventilators are 63, Mr Speaker. And what I also know, Mr Speaker, is this year, in the middle of this wave of the pandemic in New South Wales, over the course of these many months, some 92 people have passed away in New South Wales over the course of 2021. What we know is when the second wave, which went through Victoria this same time last year, 820 people passed away over the course of 2020 in Victoria. Mr Speaker, the overwhelming majority of those who passed away in Victoria last year were in residential aged care. And what we have been able to achieve this year, prior to these most recent waves hitting both New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT, is that we have double-dose vaccination rates in our aged care facilities upwards of 80%. And what that has meant is, Mr Speaker, is that our most vulnerable in our community this year, because of the vaccines compared to last year, and in particular the priority we placed, Mr Speaker, on vaccinating those in residential aged care facilities and ensuring that we were able to visit all of those facilities to ensure that those double-dose vaccinations were provided, has saved hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of lives. And, Mr Speaker, I want to thank the InReach teams. I want to thank all of those who are part of them, the clinical staff, those who prepared and planned them, Professor Murphy, General Fruin, and others who ensured that by putting in place those arrangements, Mr Speaker, so many lives have been spared this year as a result of the second and third waves that we've seen come through our cities. In addition to that, Mr Speaker, I appreciate the work that Professor Murphy has been doing. It has been an ongoing work for many, many months to ensure that he has been working with the heads of the health departments of all the states and territories to ensure that our state health systems and hospital systems are in a position of resilience to deal with further demands placed on their system. And we know that from the information that has been presented that in ICUs that we can anticipate around about up to 20% in New South Wales of their capacity being used up because of COVID. And for the rest of the country, that's around 10%. That's over the next week or so. And so we are working closely with the states and territories to ensure that the resilience is in place there in those state health systems. Further work was tasked again next Friday, and I'm expecting that back over the course of this week. And I want to thank Professor Murphy and all the secretaries, all the health departments around our country to make sure our hospital strong system is resilient to deal with the challenges that are ahead.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. I call the member for Warringah.
Thank you. To the Prime Minister. Over the weekend, we saw thousands of text messages and emails sent to constituents of many electorates by the United Australia Party, spreading misinformation about vaccines and lockdowns. The past two federal elections have been influenced by misinformation and deceptive political advertising from each of the major parties. Do you support politicians and third parties having the ability to lie in political advertising? And if you don't, will you do something about it?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. We are very serious about combating misinformation. There is a COVID-19 misinformation portal, Mr Speaker, called COVID-19 Mythbusting, which I refer to the member on the australia.gov.au website that corrects myths and misinformation about COVID-19. The Department of Home Affairs reviews and refers online misinformation about COVID-19 to social media platforms to request that they are taken down. And the Department of Health also has a feature on their website called Is It True? To help answer questions people may have about COVID-19 vaccines and respond to vaccine misinformation they may have heard, Mr Speaker. This is important information for people in our community today to ensure that they can be protected from the threat of misinformation. And the Department of Home Affairs works closely in particular with the Department of Health to provide multicultural communities with accurate information on COVID-19. Home Affairs counters the threat of COVID-19 misinformation and disinformation by ensuring accurate and authoritative information is accessible and in language. Home Affairs Community Liaison Office Network supports CALD communities by relaying community concerns to government and disseminating that information. Settlement service providers also assist in conveying in-language messaging to humanitarian entrants and their communities. The COVID-19 in-language website provides accurate official government information translated into 63 languages, including fact sheets on COVID-19 misinformation and disinformation and on the vaccine rollout. Indeed, I participated in quite a number of those Zoom forums, Mr Speaker, with multicultural leaders across New South Wales in particular to deal with those very issues. And so I would refer the member to those very important resources and encourage her to share those resources with members of her community.
And I call the member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer remind the House of the Morrison government's strong and enduring support for small businesses around Australia, including in my electorate of Reid, as we move towards implementing the National Plan? And is the Treasurer aware of any threats to small business as they struggle through the effects of the pandemic?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Reid for her question, acknowledge her strong support for small business across her community, Mr Speaker, and I had the privilege to join with her to visit Scabello Coffee in her electorate, who were accessing the immediate expensing provisions, Mr Speaker, which are helping them invest and grow their own business. Now, the Morrison government from day one of this pandemic has been seeking to support small and medium-sized businesses. The cash flow boost. We've passed legislated tax cuts for small and medium-sized businesses. We've put in place an expanded immediate expensing provision, the loss carry-back measure, as well as concessional loans. And this has helped contribute to a fall in the unemployment rate to a 4.6%, a 12-year low. But now, Mr Speaker, we have a desperate Labor Party that is seeking to destroy a fundamental pillar of our tax system, Mr Speaker, namely the protection of private taxpayers' confidential information, Mr Speaker. Private taxpayers' confidential information. Now, the Labor Party is seeking to force the Tax Commissioner to dump in the Senate the details of more than 10,000 businesses, Mr Speaker. This is what the Tax Commissioner has said about Labor's proposal. It will, quote, harm the public interest by undermining public confidence in his ability to keep taxation information confidential, Mr Speaker. This is what the Australian Hotels Association has said of Labor's proposal. It's a dangerous political stunt, Mr Speaker. Here is what the Australian Industry Group has said of Labor's proposal. It's misguided and a dangerous precedent that must be rejected, Mr Speaker. Here is what the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry has said about Labor's proposal. It's a deliberate attempt to smear, Mr Speaker, and this is what the Council of Small Business has said about Labor's proposal. It's been pursued for political gain. Now, Mr Speaker, at the last election, Australians knew that the Labor Party came after retirees and homeowners, Mr Speaker. Well, this election, they're coming after small business, Mr Speaker. This election, they're coming after small business. And if the Labor Party is prepared to stoop this low to force the Tax Commissioner to reveal private taxpayers' confidential information, whose information will they seek to have provided next to the Parliament? These businesses were complying with the law. These businesses were receiving government support in the middle of a once-in-a-century pandemic, and for that the Labor Party is coming after them.
The member for Macarthur.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian has said that she doesn't expect the number of patients in New South Wales intensive care units to peak until October. What extra resourcing is the Prime Minister providing to New South Wales hospitals so that intensive care units are not overwhelmed in the coming weeks and months?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank and respect the member's concerns. In particular, the first thing that we have done is provided a private hospitals guarantee. What this does is create a partnership between public and private hospitals. It means that the entire New South Wales private hospital system is available for the New South Wales Government to draw upon to assist with nursing staff, with other staff, with beds, with ICU capacity and with ventilation capacity. Across Australia, this represents pardon me, over 57,000 nurses. It represents over 100,000 staff. It represents over 30,000 beds. And so this is a fundamental partnership, the likes of which I'm not aware of having been created in Australia previously. It's already been invoked and called upon within New South Wales, and so the private hospitals viability guarantee is not just capable, it's in operation. And we also know that in terms of our funding, we're currently investing over $7.8 billion this year in New South Wales, $41 billion over the current public hospitals agreement within New South Wales. And that's expected to see significant increases of over $1 billion, investments that have seen a very large impact in a positive way upon that system. In addition to that, we are also making available masks, gloves, gowns. We are making available additional funding, and we have the capacity to provide additional ventilators through the National Medical Stockpile. However, I should say that New South Wales has done an extraordinary job in preparing its system. They have increased from a ventilator capacity in ICU from 500 to 2,000 on the latest advice of the Premier, Gladys Berejiklian, in her press conference of the 26th of August 2021. We have assisted in acquiring that ventilator capacity not just in New South Wales but around Australia. And that ventilator capacity has increased around Australia from approximately 2,000 to 7,500. And so this is preparation for all of those circumstances. And what we've seen and we've heard is that, for example, the esteemed Chief Health Officer of New South Wales, Dr Kerry Chant, has said only in recent days, we've got the capacity to work with our private hospitals, of which we have significant bed capacity, and our hospitals will be doing a lot of local planning about which patients are best cared for in which circumstances. So we've provided funds, we've provided ventilators, gloves, gowns, but above all else, staff and a partnership with the private hospitals.
And I call the member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Will the Minister please outline to the House the importance of Australia's national plan for COVID and how this plan will assist with the mental health of all Australians, including children?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Lindsay. The very first event I was involved with her was in fact a focus on mental health for children and young people in her electorate shortly after she came to office and joined this parliament. And so that commitment is deep and real and fundamental. We know the challenges of this pandemic. We see it around the world, we see it in Australia, we see it in any place where there are lockdowns. We know that with over 500,000 cases a day on average, and sadly well north of that, with over 9,000 lives lost a day on average at the moment, that this impact is ravaging countries around the world in the midst of a pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen for 100 years. So on that front, the first thing is the national plan and hope that with any mental health challenge, for people to know there's a pathway through, to know that there is a future, to know, to quote the Doherty Institute, that there is light at the end of the tunnel, is fundamentally important. And on that front, there is light at the end of the tunnel. The fact that we've seen, as the Prime Minister said, 379,000 vaccinations over the weekend, that we are now at 19,085,000 vaccinations, and that each day in the last week was a record for that respective day, and that last week was higher than any week on a per capita basis in terms of vaccinations delivered than either the United Kingdom or the United States during the course of their rollouts. All of these things are coming together to give people real and fundamental hope. And very significantly, our general practices, through their own practices, through the Commonwealth vaccination clinics and through the Aboriginal Medical Services, have now delivered over 10 million vaccines. To add to what the Prime Minister said with regards to AstraZeneca, over 6 million first doses for Australians. All of these things give hope and are fundamentally important. But at the same time, in order to support mental health, we've invested very significantly, over $500,000 directly in mental health support. In particular, support for Kids Healthline, for Headspace, Beyond Blue and for Lifeline. We've seen almost inconceivably 340 Victorian youths who, during the current lockdown, are being admitted to hospital each week with mental health concerns. That tears us apart, tears all of us apart. And the pathway through means that they have to have that light at the end of the tunnel. That's why the plan's so important, but it's also about getting kids back into playgrounds, getting kids back into schools. These things are fundamental for their education, but above all else, they are fundamental for their health and their mental health.
The member for Fenner.
My question is to the Treasurer. Why is the Morrison-Joyce government not asking businesses to repay the $13 billion in JobKeeper payments they pocketed while their revenue rose, but is sending threatening letters to Sydney and Melbourne families in lockdown demanding they pay back historic childcare subsidies? Why are the Treasurer's priorities so wrong?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, the member for Fenner wants to make lawbreakers out of businesses that receive JobKeeper, Mr Speaker, because when businesses received JobKeeper, they did so in accordance with the law, namely that there was an anticipated decline
on my left
in their turnover, Mr Speaker. Now, the member for Fenner doesn't ask me about Labor Association services or the $22 million that apparently went to unions and other associated entities. Mr Speaker, the reality is JobKeeper was a remarkable program. They're not my words. They're the words of the Governor of the Reserve Bank. And indeed, the program saved 700,000 plus jobs, and it's been a key part of our economic recovery. Let me remind the honourable members opposite what the Australian economy was looking like when JobKeeper was announced. The unemployment rate Treasury thought could reach as high as 15%. We could see up to 2 million Australians unemployed, Mr Speaker. We were literally standing on the edge of the economic abyss. We saw JobKeeper come in and immediately it stemmed the tide of job losses, and we saw 9 consecutive weeks of increases in consumer and business confidence, Mr Speaker. We saw increases in confidence as a result of JobKeeper, and we have seen the unemployment rate get now down to a 12-year low of 4.6%, Mr Speaker. 4.6% compared to when Labor was last in office, when the unemployment rate was 5.7%. Now, Mr Speaker, JobKeeper has been a key part of our economic recovery. And according to Treasury, in the review that they undertook, it was well targeted. It was well targeted because we saw in the month of April, we saw an average decline of 37% in JobKeeper businesses. And we know that small businesses right across the country have relied on JobKeeper to stay in business. Now, those opposite are seeking to attack those small businesses that receive JobKeeper. Those opposite are now seeking to have their important, confidential, private taxpayers' details revealed publicly, Mr Speaker. And we know what the industry groups have said about that. And I repeat to the House, The Australian Hotels Association said Labor's tactic is a dangerous political stunt. The Australian Industry Group said Labor's tactic is misguided and a dangerous precedent. The Australian Chamber of Commerce has called Labor's tactic a desperate attempt to smear, and COSBOA have said of Labor's tactic it's pursued by pure political gain. You cannot trust the Labor Party. You cannot trust the Labor Party.
The Treasurer's time has concluded, and I call the member for Moore.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is keeping Australians safe and secure through regional partnerships and alliances?
The Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for his question and thank him for his support of the Australian Defence Force. Mr Speaker, on indulgence, I just want to make the House aware that there are media reports. I haven't received confirmation as yet, but that tragically 2 soldiers are reported to have died in a vehicle rollover near Townsville. I'm waiting for further details on that, but of course we have significant personnel and assets around Laverack Barracks and in the north of our country. There are movements on the road every day, and it is a very dangerous task that our troops are involved in, even during training exercises and the movement of equipment up and down our national highways. So, Mr Speaker, that's very sad news for our country to learn, and our condolences and thoughts are with their friends and their family, and we'll have more to say on that during the day. Mr Speaker, what we've seen in Afghanistan over the course of the last couple of weeks is that our relationship with the United States and the United Kingdom in particular is absolutely invaluable. We wouldn't have had the intelligence in relation to the terrorist attack without our relationship with the United States and in the Five Eyes compact that we have. We wouldn't have received that information, which ultimately contributed to us making a decision for our troops not to be at Abbey Gate, and we are very grateful for that support. We wouldn't have been able, Mr Speaker, without the 1,000 British troops who were at Hamid Karzai Airport, providing the security there, along with the 4,000 American troops, to lift any of the 4,100 people that we have brought back to our country, or those who are on their way back to our country now. The relationship with those 2 countries is absolutely crucial to the future security of our country. But it doesn't stop there, Mr Speaker. Our relationships with India, with Japan, in the Quad, our relationship with Vietnam, with Indonesia, with South Korea, with many other countries in the region is absolutely essential, and more so than ever. We know, Mr Speaker, that we have a deteriorating security situation in the Indo-Pacific, and it's why we have countries like Germany, the United States, the United Kingdom, others, France included, who are focusing their attention on the Indo-Pacific. We know that NATO has taken a particular interest in what is taking place in the Indo-Pacific. We are concerned, Mr Speaker, about the militarisation of areas in the South China Sea. We are worried about coercion. We are worried about activities otherwise that would seek to undermine the sovereignty of our near and dear neighbours. And, Mr Speaker, our country will always stand up not only for our own values, but the values that are represented in our Five Eyes relationship, and also, Mr Speaker, those values and that sovereignty of our neighbours is absolutely paramount to us also.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr Speaker, I join with the Defence Minister in expressing my condolences to the family and friends of the 2 soldiers who've been killed in the rollover of an army vehicle near Townsville. This is a tragic loss for people wearing our uniform, serving our nation and defending our people, and my thoughts and condolences with their family and friends.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. According to ABC reports last night, delivery drivers on the Amazon Flex platform don't get workers' compensation or superannuation. They can effectively be sacked with no reason given. How will the Prime Minister prevent Australia's future being dominated by low-paid and insecure work like this?
The Prime Minister has the floor.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for his question, and I will undertake to review the matter that he's raised here today and seek that information from the Minister for Industrial Relations. Mr Speaker, what I do know is that our government has legislated to support the uncertainty of work of casuals in this country. That was the package of reforms that we brought through this parliament. They were the package of reforms that we worked through with those, both in the business community and with the trade union movement. That was the initiative which I commenced in the middle of last year, when I set out very clearly that there were many challenges that the country had to face going forward to be successful in a post-COVID world, and to ensure that there was both the certainty and flexibility necessary for the Australian economy to perform, for people who are in some uncertain work to get that certainty. And that's why we introduced that legislation, and that's why we supported it, Mr Speaker. So I note the point that has been made by the member in raising that question, but I also note the important action that our government took to create certainty for those in casual work in this country by the legislation we introduced and we ensured went through this parliament here and in the other place.
The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is ensuring our intelligence and law enforcement agencies have the resources they need to counter the threat of terrorism and keep all Australians safe?
The Minister for Home Affairs.
Well, thank you, and I thank the member for her question and acknowledge the great leadership that she shows every day in her electorate of Moncrieff. Our government has always maintained that the virus is not the only challenge to our safety and our security in a very rapidly changing world. Now, unfortunately, the events that we've seen unfold in Afghanistan, including the evil, calculated terrorist attacks, are a reminder that terrorism remains a very real and evolving threat to our communities and to our safety and to our way of life here in Australia. Now, this is a problem that we simply cannot be complacent about, and this government is certainly not complacent about national security. Now, in September 2014, the national terrorism threat was raised to probable, and it remains at that level. Now, since that time, there have been 139 people who have been charged as a result of 67 counter-terrorism operations around Australia. And there are currently 34 people before the courts for terrorism-related offences. So this is not a threat that has gone away. In fact, it's quite the opposite. So that's why our government is working very closely with our international partners, particularly our Five Eyes partners, because we are very much aware of the threat that terrorism poses to our nation. And we continue to take law enforcement, national security, particularly important to us, and we continue to pursue a range of options. Firstly, with legislation, and there was some legislation that passed the House last week, and I do thank the opposition for supporting that legislation and its passage through the House and through the Senate. And we have also, before the Parliament, legislation that deals with the management of high-risk terrorist offenders. This is something, as I've said, that the government takes particularly seriously, and this has been demonstrated by the $1.3 billion that we have provided to ASIO. They are our leading agency in national security and intelligence matters, and they are now well equipped from a resource point of view with that $1.3 billion to make sure that they can continue the work that they do, particularly looking at intelligence threats and terrorism issues, and they will continue to do that. I think it's fair to say that this government certainly understands national security. We understand the risk that is posed through terrorist organisations to the Australian way of life, and we will continue to do everything that we possibly can to counter those terrible, terrible events.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question's again to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister adopt Labor's plan to provide the Fair Work Commission with the necessary powers to act on insecure work so that Australian workers can be better protected from exploitation and dangerous working conditions? Shouldn't every Australian worker be paid at least the minimum wage? And are there any circumstances where the government supports workers being paid below the minimum wage?
The Minister representing the Minister for Industrial Relations.
I do thank the Shadow Minister for his question. Our government is committed to the arrangements which exist under the Fair Work Act.
Everyone, with yet another day of
That was someone remoting in who hadn't turned their microphone off, but looks fine now. Okay.
Mr Speaker, our government remains committed to the arrangements in the Fair Work Act, and that includes matters to deal with the gig economy and, of course, secure work. Now, Labor announced a very light on detail secure Australian jobs plan in February 2021. Mr Speaker, the existing objective of the Fair Work Act is to provide for a balanced framework for cooperative relations between employers and employees and the delivery of a framework that is fair to working Australians while being flexible for businesses. And this framework is designed to carefully balance the needs of employers and employees. And the fact is, Mr Speaker, that Australians do value the diversity that the labour market and its various features offers. And, Mr Speaker, we are committed to the arrangements which exist under the Fair Work Act.
The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women. The Morrison government's National Summit on Women's Safety will take place next week. Will the Minister please outline to the House the action the government is taking to support women's economic security, including through the COVID-19 pandemic, and what the national plan will mean for women's economic security as we go forward?
The Minister representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Chisholm for her question and commend her on her leadership across so many women's issues in her electorate. And it is heartening to see that there are more women in work now than before the pandemic began. That's a positive trend that I know all members on all sides of the chamber will acknowledge. And the government is determined to build on this strong progress and see women's workforce participation continue to grow, especially as we hit our vaccination targets and we reopen the economy. Because, Mr Speaker, the certainty and confidence that you have around your job prospects, your work, your employment, your income, go to the heart of your economic security. And women's economic security and financial independence are critical components of women's safety. That's why they're going to feature prominently as a topic of conversation at the National Summit on Women's Safety next week, being co-chaired by the Minister for Women and the Minister for Women's Safety in the other place, both doing an outstanding job with this summit. The Women's Budget Statement this year included $1.9 billion in initiatives to strengthen women's workforce participation and their economic security, and that investment is now more important than ever, not just for women's safety but to benefit our whole economy. With lockdowns in Victoria, here in the ACT and in my home state of New South Wales, of course these lockdowns affect the economy, but they can sometimes disproportionately affect women and the economy. It is an incredibly difficult time for women, coping with so many challenges on the home front as well as often on the work front, managing homeschooling, toddlers at home, dealing with the mental wellness of their family and worrying, of course, about their finances, and often it does seem, Mr Speaker, putting themselves last. So it's so important now that we support women through the direct payments that we're making to make up for lost work hours, but also through providing additional targeted support for childcare centres, particularly in areas under lockdown, because we want childcare and early learning to be there for women and be there for families and be there for children on the other side of this. So, importantly, the government is providing families additional absence days, allowing gap fee waivers to keep children enrolled, and it means that services have still been able to receive the childcare subsidy even if the children haven't attended, to keep those services strong. But, Mr Speaker, we can't lock down forever. Lockdowns are causing real harm, particularly for women's economic security. And the national plan is our way out, and it is what's needed. It's needed for our economy, our mental health, our national recovery, not just for women, but indeed for all Australians.
The member for Whitlam.
Speaker, question to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister said that he supports the premiers in the work they do to save this country, to save lives and to save livelihoods. Why then did the Prime Minister support Clive Palmer's High Court case to tear down Western Australia's borders? And why is it reported that the New South Wales Premier regards him as an evil bully?
I just say to, I'm not going to call the Prime Minister immediately. The last part of the question is out of order, but the part of the question relating to the High Court challenge is in order. The Prime Minister has the call.
Rather than do it later in the day, I can confirm that erroneous report, Mr Speaker. The New South Wales Premier has made it very clear to me in her message that she has never used such words, ever, Mr Speaker.
I just said that part of the question was out
Fair
of order.
Enough.
The Prime Minister has the call.
So, Mr Speaker, I won't address the smears of those opposite. What I will do, Mr Speaker, is address the more substantive matter, and I seek your indulgence, Mr Speaker, on restating that part of the question.
Oh, well, I won't restate the question. If you could just restate the question without the bit that I've ruled out of order, otherwise we'll just move on.
Thanks, Speaker. The question of the Prime Minister is why then did the Prime Minister support Clive Palmer's High Court case to tear down the West Australian borders?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Again, Mr Speaker, that the member must be misinformed because the Commonwealth did not pursue that case. The Commonwealth did not pursue that case. And it is erroneous to suggest that, Mr Speaker, that is what the government did. The government did not pursue that case, Mr Speaker, at all. We did not pursue that case. And the Labor Party continues to push this falsehood around the country, Mr Speaker, as they have a habit of doing. The each-way position of the Labor Party across the pandemic is there for all to see. They support the plan, they don't support the plan. They do support the plan, they don't support the plan, Mr Speaker. They support JobKeeper, they're opposed to JobKeeper.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Mr Speaker, the question went to—
No, just on the point of
on
order.
relevance. The question was very direct, because it's a very short question.
Well,
now
it was
before,
very direct in the
before
end,
the chair.
put it that way. It wasn't direct at the beginning.
Correct. Is about the government's support for the WA High Court challenge of Clive Palmer that cost taxpayers $1 million. $1 million.
Seat. I just say to the Leader of the Opposition, he's got into the habit of using a point of order to ask not only the question again, but now even ask additional questions. So if he wants to ask an additional question, he can do that. That's what question time's for. The Prime Minister has the call, and he does need to be relevant to the question, but I'm not discounting the fact that the original question did have some political commentary and at the heart of it an accusation. The Prime Minister has the call.
I'll restate what I said at the commencement of my answer, Mr Speaker. What the Labor Party is putting about is not true. We did not pursue that case, Mr Speaker. We did not pursue that case. That is not what occurred. And for the opposition, for the Labor Party, to peddle untruth, Mr Speaker, is something I've become used to with this Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party.
And I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Implementation of the National Plan will create more opportunities for Australian exporters. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting our exporters and how this assistance will create more Australian jobs as we prepare to open up under the National Plan?
The Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for North Sydney for his question. And I know he understands how important the National Plan is to our tourism industry, something he's very passionate about, but it is also important for our exporters. 1 in 5 Australians are dependent on export-related businesses, and in regional Australia it's 1 in 4. And We continue to provide support for our exporters as we seek to implement our national plan. On Friday, the government announced that it was extending IFAM and providing another $260.9 million for the IFAM program. We have now provided nearly $1 billion for IFAM to support Australian jobs in our export industries. And this has led to some remarkable results which has benefited every state and the Northern Territory. Abalone from South Australia to Hong Kong, mangoes from the Northern Territory to South Korea and Canada, tuna from New South Wales to Japan and the US, strawberries from Western Australia to Malaysia and Singapore, Victorian lamb to the Middle East, live coral trout from far north Queensland to Hong Kong, and Tasmanian salmon to China. But, Mr Speaker, we cannot continue to subsidise and benefit these exporters forever, and that is why the national plan is so important. We cannot continue to provide support to those exporters from all those states forever. We have to eventually open up our economy, safely open up our economy, so those exporters can get on and do the things that they love to do. Go over and visit those overseas markets, build the partnerships they need with the importers from those countries. Make sure that when it comes to investing, whether it be investing in other countries to grow their businesses or seeking investment into Australia so that they can grow their businesses, that requires us being able to travel overseas, and it requires for people to be able to come to Australia. And that's what our national plan sets out. It sets out how we can safely do that. And that's why we need all states and all territories signing up to our national plan, because you can't have our wheat exporters, our iron ore exporters, those who are pursuing new opportunities in new energy when it comes to hydrogen. You can't have them here in Australia and not being able to go out and seek those markets. They have to be able to travel, and that's why our national plan is so important. That's why we're backing the national plan, and it's why we need all states and territories to do exactly the same.
The member for Canberra.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Health. Last week, the Minister for Health said the government's COVID Safe app had played an important role in contact tracing. But according to the Canberra Times, a report was handed to the minister in March this year which said the app had provided little assistance to the health response between March and November 2020 and increased the workload of contact tracers for little reward. Is that true?
Tell the truth.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The COVID app has 7.6 million Australians who are registered to use. From the 779 COVID-positive users that have had uploads, the app recorded 1.65 million digital handshakes and 2,827 potential close contacts. In particular, we know that in the case of New South Wales, the example of the Mounties, of the outbreak at the Mounties, we had a clear identification of cases which had otherwise not been notified, positive cases, and that allowed for the tracking and tracing. That allowed for the specific outcomes, which meant that that outbreak was able to have been contained. And so what we see is that this is one tool that is available to states and territories. We continue to encourage all of them to use it, and we believe that, as we've seen in the United Kingdom, for example, it has significant potential here. But most importantly, those examples show its capacity and its impact.
The member for Barker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. Will the minister please update the House on how securing affordable, reliable energy for families and businesses in my electorate of Barker will secure our future post-COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Barker for his question. his steadfast commitment in affordable, reliable energy for businesses across his electorate, businesses like the Naracoorte Hotel that I hope to visit again in the not-too-distant future, Mr Speaker. Businesses that need affordable, reliable energy to secure their future post-pandemic, Mr Speaker. And of course he knows our plan is working. Our default market offer has delivered businesses in electorates like his and right across South Australia up to $2,800 in reduction in prices for electricity, Mr Speaker. Households under the default market offer in South Australia, $700 a year in savings. And under this government, we've seen the lowest wholesale prices in 9 years, Mr Speaker, and we've secured the fuel South Australians need to keep things moving. We're securing investment and facilitating investment in transmission like the PEC project, Mr Speaker. But we also need to make sure our electricity grid is fit for the future. Now, last year alone, we saw 7 gigawatts of renewable capacity invested. That's the equivalent of 4 large coal-fired power stations in 1 year. And with that, whilst there's very significant reduction in emissions, there's also challenges. We need to balancing investment in dispatchable capacity. And that's why we're driving reforms in the national electricity market. And we're making sure there's essential system services in place, the right investment in transmission infrastructure, and of course incentives to invest in dispatchable capacity, Mr Speaker. Now there's strong support for these reforms. Tomago Aluminium, the largest user of electricity in Australia, the CEO, Matt Howell, has welcomed the reforms and said reliability is the key, and I quote, "It matters for everybody, but it matters even more for aluminium smelters." AWU Secretary Dan Walton has welcomed the changes. He said they were needed to avoid catastrophic outcomes for Australian manufacturers. The CFMEU Mining and Energy Union National President, Tony Marr, echoed those sentiments and said we cannot have a Hazelwood situation repeated across the country, Mr Speaker. Now, as the ESB, the Energy Security Board Chair, Kerry Schott, has said these reforms will stop price spikes. She has dubbed opponents to the changes crazy, Mr Speaker. These reforms are an essential part of securing the energy market now and into the future, and on this side of the place, Mr Speaker, we all, like the member for Barker, are absolutely committed to the affordable, reliable energy Australians need as we come out of the pandemic.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and it goes to his answer just previously, where he suggested the federal government had nothing to do with Clive Palmer's court case against the WA government just last year. Isn't that not true? Isn't it a fact that the federal government incurred costs of $770,000 for the government solicitor, $66,000 for experts and $41,000 to Clive Palmer as a result of the intervention in the case? Why does this Prime Minister never accept responsibility?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I said that the government didn't pursue the case, and that is exactly the truth of the matter. And for the fact that the Leader of the Opposition would seek to misrepresent that in this House, Mr Speaker, is a reflection on him, not the government. Mr Speaker, the government chose not to pursue that case. I discussed the matter with the Premier, Mr Speaker, and the government chose not to pursue it. The Leader of the Opposition interjects about the use of taxpayers' money, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, given that we are now over 50% of the population that received a first dose, under the Leader of the Opposition's plan, he would have shelled out $3 billion for nothing.
Prime Minister, he's answering now a question he wasn't asked. The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Veterans Affairs and the Minister for Defence Personnel. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting and assisting our veterans and their families, particularly at this very challenging time?
The Minister for Veterans Affairs and Defence Personnel.
Well, I thank the member for Boothby for her question, but before I continue, I just wanted to say that the reports out of Townsville this afternoon are extraordinarily tragic, Mr Speaker, and Townsville is a very tight-knit community, and I know that I extend the condolences of everyone in this place to the family and the friends, but also the colleagues of those who lost their lives this afternoon. And I thank the member for Boothby for her question, and I note that the member for Boothby has a very proud military history in her family. I know that her great-grandfather served on the Western Front in the First World War at Pozières and Bullecourt, was wounded, was taken prisoner of war for 18 months before returning to Australia, where he settled at Lower Mitcham. So I thank her family for that service and also for the member's enduring interest in Veterans Affairs. Mr Speaker, the events last week in Kabul were a murderous atrocity, and if anyone was ever in any doubt about the righteousness of the Australian mission in Afghanistan, this was a brutal reminder of the criminals and terrorists that we were fighting and the threats that they pose to the security of our nation and the security of the world. And our country, Mr Speaker, is extraordinarily proud of the men and women of the ADF, but also our veterans who served in Afghanistan. Not only did they make Australia and the world a safer place, but they helped make Afghanistan a better place. They built bridges and schools and ran clinics, Mr Speaker. Since 2002, school enrolments have increased tenfold in Afghanistan. They gave girls education and women the opportunity to work. Access to basic health care increased from 9% to 57% when the international community was in Afghanistan. And these are the stories that our veterans want told, Mr Speaker. And they served in the finest traditions of the Australian Defence Forces, and we owe them a great debt of gratitude. And, Mr Speaker, last week I spoke of the support available to our veterans, of Open Arms, the 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week counselling service that's available, Safe Zone support for those who want to call anonymously. And, Mr Speaker, I'm about to announce the 112 organisations that will share in the $2.39 million of funding under the Veteran and Community Grants Program, which also support veteran health and well-being. And hopefully I'll be telling the House more about that soon. But, Mr Speaker, there is something that everyone in the community can do this week to support the families of those who've served and sacrificed so much for our nation, because, as many of you will know, it is Legacy Week. So I would urge everyone to go to legacy.com to buy a badge, to buy other Legacy products, or even just make a donation to help Legacy, help the families of those who've given so much to our country.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr.
Sorry. Just on indulgence.
On indulgence, can I join with the Minister for Veterans Affairs, and I'm sure every member of this House, in encouraging all of our constituents out there to give support to Legacy. They do amazing work for the families of our veterans, and they are a very worthy charity.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and to add to an earlier answer, Mr Speaker, I've referred to the number of AstraZeneca doses that have been administered in Australia. I said I believed it to be around about 10 million. I can confirm it's 9.6 million, Mr Speaker, and we would expect that 10 million mark to be hit not too far from now, and that 4.7 million of those doses have actually been administered since the 1st of July of this year, which I think is an extraordinary achievement of the National Vaccination Program, Mr Speaker, that so many AstraZeneca doses have been able to be administered since July. There were many challenges earlier. I remember standing up at the end of June encouraging Australians to consider taking that AstraZeneca vaccine, and since then 4.7 million doses have been administered. Thank you, Australia.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, I seek leave to give a personal explanation.
Does the Leader of the Opposition claim to have been misrepresented?
I do, Mr Speaker.
You may proceed.
Yes, Mr Speaker. During question time, the Prime Minister suggested that I was speaking an untruth in suggesting the Commonwealth had joined with Clive Palmer in the legal case against the WA government. Mr Speaker, I seek leave to table the document from the High Court of Australia, which includes a notice of intervention. The Attorney-General intervenes in support of the position of the plaintiffs, where the federal government joined with Clive Palmer and Mineralogy Proprietary Limited as the first and second plaintiffs against the State of Western Australia and Christopher John Dawson as the second defendant to try to overturn decisions that the WA government had made.
Is leave granted?
Leave's not granted.
Leave's not granted. Just while I've got everyone here, I just want to correct a media error that occurred on the Insiders program in the Talking Pictures segment, where there was commentary to the effect that these Perspex screens that are here were finally here after 18 months, and there was a slight on the department. Can I just point out what I thought was fairly obvious, and that is that they're here because of the outbreak in the ACT. That's why they're here, and there's a lot of people doing a lot of hard work, but I just wanted to correct that. I'm not going to correct every inaccuracy that occurs, because as you all know, we'd need to extend the sittings, probably for an extra week. The Leader of the House with papers.
Where would you start, Mr Speaker? Mr Speaker, documents are tabled in accordance with the list circulated to honourable members earlier today. Full details of the documents will be recorded in the votes and proceedings.
I thank the Leader of the House. And I call the member for Macon.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.